She wasn't the kind of woman people remembered. That was fine. Opal Finch had spent 31 years perfecting the art of being forgettable. She wore beige cardigans and flat shoes that didn't click on marble floors. She kept her honey brown hair pinned back in a way that said, "I am furniture, please ignore me." She ate lunch at her desk. She said good morning to people who never said it back. She was the bookkeeper for Ridgeline Maritime Holdings, a perfectly legitimate import-export firm with beautiful offices on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, and an absolutely impeccable set of books that she personally made sure balanced to the penny every single month. She was very good at her job. She was also, though she had spent considerable effort not thinking about this, very good at noticing things she wasn't supposed to notice. Like the fact that Ridgeline Maritime Holdings didn't actually move much cargo. Like the fact that the men who came to the executive floor didn't look like shipping executives. They looked like men who had learned to stand very still in rooms where loud noises might get you killed. Like the fact that her direct supervisor, a thin, nervous man named Haddon Webb, always excused himself from the office when a certain Blacktown car pulled into the underground garage, and like the fact that the name on the lease, buried in the corporate filings she'd processed her first week on the job and promptly compartmentalized somewhere deep and waterproof in her brain, was not Ridgeline Maritime Holdings at all. It was Crestfall Group LLC, and Crestfall Group LLC belonged, according to 3 seconds of careful public records research she had done exactly once and never repeated, to a man named Stellan Rourke. Opal knew who Stellan Rourke was. Everyone in Chicago who paid any attention knew who Stellan Rourke was, the same way everyone knew which neighborhoods you didn't walk through after dark, which judges retired early, with very comfortable pensions, which dock inspectors took unusually nice vacations. You knew these things not because anyone told you, but because Chicago had its own kind of gravity. And Stellan Rourke was where everything eventually fell. She had filed that information in the same place she filed the cargo discrepancies and the executive floor visitors, and the way Haddon Webb's hands shook on certain Tuesday mornings. She did not think about it. She did her books. She kept her head down. She had a small apartment in Wicker Park with a tabby cat named Chester who liked to sleep on her adding machine. And she had a good coffee maker and 3 seasons of a British baking show she hadn't finished yet. And that was enough. That was a perfectly good life. That was what she told herself on a Thursday evening in November, when she stayed late to reconcile a wire transfer discrepancy she'd caught at 4:58 in the afternoon, because that was the kind of person she was. The kind who stayed until 6:30 to fix a rounding error that would have driven her insane all weekend. The office was empty. The cleaning crew didn't come until 8. The hum of the servers was the only sound, and the Chicago skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows like something that didn't belong to her. She was deep in column J, cross-referencing routing numbers, when she found it, not a rounding error, not a discrepancy, a second set of books, buried inside the legitimate files, formatted to look like a backup archive, accessible only if you knew exactly which subfolder to open and had her specific access credentials, which meant whoever had put it there had assumed she would never look, or had assumed that if she did look, she wouldn't understand what she was seeing. They had miscalculated on both counts. Opal sat very still for a long moment. Chester was at home on the adding machine. The skyline glittered. Her hands were completely steady, which she found slightly alarming, because what she was looking at was a detailed financial record of approximately $43 million moving through shell accounts over the past 8 months. And the routing patterns were. The routing patterns were beautiful, actually, in the way that a very elegant, very illegal construction could be beautiful, and she hated herself a little for thinking that. She copied nothing. She printed nothing. She closed the subfolder closed the archive, logged out, shut down her computer, put on her coat, picked up her bag, and took the elevator down to the parking garage. She was 3 steps from her car when the lights went out. She came back to consciousness in pieces. First, the smell, diesel and damp concrete, and something metallic underneath. A warehouse, some part of her brain noted clinically, and then the rest of her caught up, and the clinical part was briefly overwhelmed by simple animal terror. Her wrists were zip-tied to the arms of a wooden chair. Her ankles were bound. Her head ached on the left side where something had connected in the parking garage, and her bottom lip felt swollen. She was still wearing her beige cardigan and her flat shoes, which struck her absurdly as the most undignified detail of the whole situation. There were 2 men standing near a door she couldn't see clearly. They weren't looking at her. They were the kind of men who stood like they'd been placed, like furniture arranged by someone who thought about these things. She breathed. She did the only thing she knew how to do when she was frightened, which was to observe. Concrete floor. Exposed beams overhead. 3 industrial lights, 2 of them working. Wooden crates stacked along the west wall. No, east wall. She could see the lake through a gap in the corrugated paneling, which meant she was on the east side of the city, probably somewhere along the river. The smell was river water and old wood and diesel. The men near the door were professionals. They weren't nervous. Nervous men fidgeted, shifted their weight, checked their phones. These men stood like rocks. That was somehow worse. She was in the middle of calculating how long she'd been unconscious. Based on how much her wrists hurt when the door opened, and the men stepped aside without being asked. And Opal understood, suddenly and completely, exactly how much trouble she was in. She'd never seen Stellan Rourke in person. She had once found a photograph in a financial filing, a background check buried in an old HR document, and she had studied it for exactly 3 seconds before filing it away, because even then she had known, in that waterproof compartment in her brain, that looking too long at that photograph was a mistake. He was taller than she'd expected. That was the first thing. Then, the way he moved, which was quiet in a way that large men usually weren't, contained and deliberate. Dark suit, no tie, dark hair, shorter on the sides. A face that had been arranged by genetics into something unfairly striking, and then rearranged by experience into something harder and colder than God had probably intended. He looked at her the way a man looked at a problem he was deciding how to solve. Opal looked back at him. Her hands were still steady, which she still found alarming. "You found the archive," he said. It wasn't a question. "I found a discrepancy," she said. Her voice was level. She was quietly proud of that. "I was reconciling a wire transfer, and then you found the archive." She didn't answer. He came closer, not menacing exactly, not performing it the way the other men did, just closing distance, the way someone did when they wanted to read something clearly. "Miss Finch," he said. She blinked. She didn't know why the use of her name startled her more than any of the rest of it. "I need to know what you saw," he said. "And I need to know if you told anyone." "I didn't tell anyone," she said. "I came directly to the parking garage. You know that because your men were already there." Something shifted in his face, barely perceptible, but she caught it. She caught things. "What did you see?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Chester on the adding machine. She thought about the British baking show, 3 seasons unwatched. She thought about the fact that she was zip-tied to a wooden chair in a warehouse on the Chicago River, and that the man standing in front of her had, by every credible account she'd carefully not read, done considerably worse than this to people who inconvenienced him. 43 million, she said. 8 months. 14 shell accounts. 3 of them nested. The routing pattern is clean, but the timestamps on the nested accounts have a 4-hour lag that doesn't match the source bank's processing schedule, which means someone ran them manually and didn't account for time zones. She paused. You have a $17,000 discrepancy in the third nested account. It's in the third week of September. Someone transposed 2 digits. Complete silence. One of the standing men shifted, barely, and was still again. Stellan Rourke looked at her. She looked back. I didn't copy anything, she said. I didn't print anything. I was going home to my cat. Your cat, he said. Chester. He's a tabby. He sleeps on my adding machine, and he'll think I've abandoned him if I'm not home by morning. She heard herself say it, and closed her eyes, briefly opal. I'm sorry, that was. You found a $17,000 discrepancy, he said. Yes. In an archive that my own finance team has reviewed 4 times. She opened her eyes. Your finance team is looking for the wrong thing. They're looking for external interference. The transposition is internal. It happened at the source. She paused again. The person who built the archive is very good. But they made one mistake. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. What mistake? He said finally. They built it to look like a backup archive. But real backup archives have dirty data, version conflicts, timestamp overlaps, access logs that don't line up perfectly. This one is too clean. Which means if anyone with the right eye looks at it, they'll know immediately that it's not a backup. It's a record. She met his eyes. Someone made it to look like yours. But it's not. Someone is building a case. The silence this time was a different kind. They didn't untie her right away. Stellan Rourke went back to the door and spoke quietly to someone she couldn't see. And 2 of the men left, and the remaining one stood at parade rest and stared at a point somewhere above her left shoulder, and Opal sat in the chair and breathed slowly and did not cry, which she considered a significant personal achievement. She thought about the archive. She thought about the transposition. She turned it over in her head because it was better than thinking about the chair and the zip ties and the lake smell and the fact that her lip was swollen. $17,000, third week of September, the lag in the nested accounts. Someone had built a shadow ledger inside Crestfall's own files, using Crestfall's own formatting, not to steal, to frame. And they'd been careful, very careful. But they hadn't known about the backup archive tells, hadn't known that a real bookkeeper, a good one, would look at the metadata and see the seams. She was so deep in it that she almost didn't hear him come back. There's a doctor coming, he said. She looked up. He was looking at her lip. His jaw was doing something tight and controlled. It's fine, she said. It's not, he said, and his voice was different. Not softer, exactly, but stripped of the deliberate flatness he'd been using before, and what was underneath was something rougher and less managed. Your men did their job, she said. I'm not going to make an accusation. My men were told to bring you in, not to touch you. He looked at the remaining man near the wall, briefly, and she watched the man go very still in a way that suggested he understood the look's full implications. She didn't say anything. The doctor will look at your head, Stellan Rourke said. And your wrists. And then? She asked. He looked at her for a long moment. And then, he said, we figure out who's setting me up. The doctor was a compact, efficient woman named Price who didn't ask questions, which Opal appreciated enormously. She cleaned the cut above Opal's ear, confirmed no concussion, confirmed the wrists were bruised but not broken, told her to take ibuprofen and ice the lip, and left without making eye contact with anyone in the room, which was, Opal was beginning to understand, the correct strategy. Her hands were free now. She was sitting on a crate with a bottle of water she'd been given without ceremony. And Stellan Rourke was across from her, with his jacket off, and his sleeves rolled to the elbow. And 2 different men were on phones in the corners of the warehouse, and all of it had the chaotic hum of a situation being rapidly managed. She drank her water and watched. You said someone is building a case, he said, without looking up from what he was reading on a tablet. What kind of timeline are we looking at? From the transaction dates, she thought. The archive started 8 months ago. The manual runs are spaced 3 to 4 weeks apart. Whoever is doing it is patient. They're not rushing." She paused. "But the 17,000 error is new." "Third week of September, that's 2 months ago. Either they got sloppy or they're accelerating." He looked up then. "Accelerating why?" "I don't know your world," she said carefully. "But in mine, you accelerate when you think someone is about to notice. Or when you have a deadline." He set the tablet down. "You have a very specific mind, Miss Finch," he said. "I'm a bookkeeper," she said. "You're considerably more than that." She looked at her water bottle. She was aware, in a way she'd been carefully not being aware of for the past hour, that her cardigan had a tear in the left sleeve and her hair had come entirely down from its pins and was doing whatever it wanted, which was probably something humiliating, and that she was sitting on a crate in a warehouse, bruised and rumpled, while the most dangerous man in Chicago was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely classify. She was not the kind of woman people looked at that way. She was the furniture, the bookkeeper, the woman who ate lunch at her desk and wore beige and disappeared into rooms. "I should go home," she said. Chester will be fine until morning," he said. "Someone will go to your apartment." She stiffened. "To feed your cat," he said, and something crossed his face that might have been, on a different man, faint amusement. "Not to search it. I've had your building under passive surveillance for 4 months." She stared at him. "You're the only person in that office who has never made a mistake in your work," he said. "Not once. In 18 months. Every other bookkeeper, every finance associate, every administrator has had at least one error. You have had none." He was watching her carefully. "I wanted to know what kind of person was that precise." She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it in the waterproof compartment and put a weight on the lid. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. What he needed her to do was, it turned out, find the leak. Not the leak in the money. That was already contained, the accounts frozen, the trail being carefully walked back by men in other rooms. What he needed was the person. The patient, careful, accelerating person who had spent 8 months building a shadow ledger inside Crestfall's files, using Crestfall's formatting, making it look like Stellan Rourke's own documentation of his own financial crimes. Someone close, someone with access, someone who understood the architecture well enough to mirror it. Opal worked for 11 hours straight. They brought her a desk, an actual desk, moved in from somewhere, set up in a clear corner of the warehouse, and a laptop, and a second monitor, and access to the full archive, and she built herself a clean copy in an isolated environment, and went through it the way she went through everything, which was systematically, without hurrying, following each thread to its end before picking up the next one. Stellan Rourke did not hover. He moved through the warehouse with a quiet constancy, checking in, reading things, speaking to people in low tones, and every few hours he appeared beside her with coffee or water, or, at 2 in the morning, a plate of food from somewhere that turned out to be surprisingly good pasta, which she ate without stopping work, and only realized after the plate was gone that she'd been hungry for hours. She found the leak at 4:47 in the morning. Not a person, not yet, not exactly, but a pattern. The manual runs happened on specific dates. She mapped the dates against Crestfall's internal calendar, the one she'd had clearance to access for 18 months. And the pattern landed, consistently, on dates when a specific set of individuals had after-hours building access. She narrowed it by cross-referencing the archive's metadata with the building's server logs, which she technically didn't have clearance for, but which someone had given her access to 3 hours earlier, without explaining why, and she narrowed it again, and at 4:47 she had a name. She sat looking at it for a moment, then she said, "Mr. Rourke." He was there in 30 seconds, which meant he'd been close. He leaned over the desk and looked at the screen, and she watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do before, something that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. "Haddon Webb," he said. "You're head of internal compliance," she said. He had after-hours access on every relevant date. The archive mirrors his personal documentation style. I recognized the formatting from memos he'd circulated, the way he structures nested folders, and she pulled up another window. He made an error in September because he was sick. He was out for 3 days with a respiratory infection. He ran the manual entry when he came back, and he was still on medication. That's where the transposition came from. Silence. $17,000, she said quietly, because Haddon Webb had a chest cold. Stellan Rourke straightened. He looked at the screen for another moment. Then he looked at her. At her, specifically. Not at the screen, not past her. And the expression on his face was not the cold, problem-solving look from earlier in the night. She didn't know what to call it. She filed it with the other thing, under the weight. "Get some sleep," he said. "There's a room." "I need to get home. Your cat has been fed." He held up a phone briefly, showing her a photograph. Chester on what appeared to be Opal's couch, being held with baffling competence by a man in a black jacket, who looked like he'd never held a cat in his life and was making a dedicated effort. Chester looked entirely unbothered. She laughed. She hadn't meant to. It came out small and tired and genuine, and she heard it hang in the warehouse air, and she looked at the screen to avoid looking at his face. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She slept 4 hours on a cot in a side room that was cleaner than she'd expected, and woke to grey light coming through a high window and Chester's absence, which she felt as a specific ache. When she came back out into the main space, Haddon Webb was there. He was sitting in the chair she'd been zip-tied to the night before, which she understood was deliberate. He was not zip-tied. He looked like a man who had spent the night understanding the dimensions of the mistake he'd made, which was its own kind of restraint. He looked at her. She looked at him. She'd always thought Haddon Webb was nervous because he was nervous by nature. She understood now that he was nervous because he was carrying something that would get him killed. "I didn't know you were," he started. "I know," she said. She wasn't angry. She was tired and her lip still hurt, and she didn't have the energy for anger. "Who approached you?" He looked at the floor. "Haddon Bergson," he said. "Regional," he said. He swallowed. He said Rourke was going down regardless, that I could either be on the right side of it or... He stopped. Opal looked at Stellan Rourke, who was standing at the edge of the room, and who was looking at Haddon Webb with an expression that gave nothing away. And she thought about Haddon's shaking hands on certain Tuesday mornings, and she thought about what it cost to carry that kind of fear for however long he'd been carrying it, and she thought about how neatly Bergson, whoever Bergson was, had constructed that particular trap. She wasn't a good person, exactly. She didn't think the world sorted that cleanly, but she understood what it was to be afraid of the wrong things for too long. "He didn't steal anything," she said to the room. "He built a record. He was following instructions from someone higher. The financial loss to Crestfall is 0. Stellan Rourke looked at her. "The damage is reputational and legal," she said, "which is containable now that the archive is identified and the construction methodology is documented. Haddon Webb is at this point more useful as a source than as..." She stopped. As the alternative. Haddon was staring at her. She looked at him. "You should cooperate fully," she said. "And you should probably never accept a job offer from someone who tells you someone is going down regardless. That sentence exists to recruit scared people into taking the fall." The silence in the room was very complete. Then Stellan Rourke said to the men near the door, "Take him to Callaway. Full debrief. He talks, he walks," she breathed out. The town car was black and warm and quiet, and the Chicago skyline was going gold-pink at the edges, in a way that suggested morning had finally committed to arriving, and Opal sat in the back seat and looked at it, and tried to understand what the last 18 hours had been. Stellan Rourke sat beside her, not close, but in the same enclosed space, which was its own kind of close, and she was very aware of the distance and of his hands resting loose on his thighs, and of the way the morning light hit his profile, in a way she was categorically not thinking about. "You advocated for him," he said. "He was used," she said. "That's different from being a threat. In my world, the distinction doesn't usually matter." "It should," she said. "The distinction is where the actual problem lives. Haddon Webb is scared. Bergson is the problem. If you make an example of Haddon, Bergson finds another scared person. If you use Haddon to get to Bergson..." She stopped. "You know this. You don't need me to explain your own logic." He was quiet. "Why did you stay?" he said. "Last night when I gave you the archive access, you could have misdirected me, given me a false lead, bought yourself time." She thought about that. "Because whoever built that archive was going to get you eventually," she said. "Not because they were smarter than you, because they were patient and you didn't know they were there. And she paused, honest in a way she was too tired to edit. "I don't like things that don't balance. The archive was a wound in the books. I needed to find it." He turned his head. She felt it more than saw it. "Chester is going to need to be picked up," she said to the window. "I know," he said. "I should probably also." She stopped, looked at her hands. Her wrists had purple-green bruising spreading up toward her forearms. "I should probably update my resume. Your position at Ridgeline is secure," he said. She looked at him then. She couldn't help it. "You found a $17,000 discrepancy in a $43 million shadow archive," he said. "You mapped a leak in 11 hours. You advocated for a man who helped set you up." A pause. "Your position is more than secure." She didn't know what her face did. She hoped it did something reasonable. "I'm still just the bookkeeper," she said. He looked at her for a moment that was longer than it needed to be. "No," he said. "You've never been just anything." The city moved past the windows. Somewhere across town, Chester was on a couch with a stranger in a black jacket, entirely unbothered, waiting for her to come home. The morning light came in gold and indifferent through the glass. Opal Finch thought about the archive, clean and constructed, and full of seams she was the only one who'd seen. She thought about balance sheets and routing numbers, and the particular satisfaction of a column that finally resolved. She thought about the man beside her in the grey quiet of the car, and the way he'd brought her pasta at 2 in the morning without making it mean anything, and the way it had meant something anyway. She looked at her wrists. She looked at the skyline. She thought, "I am going to need to renegotiate my salary." 3 weeks later, Opal sat across from Stellan Rourke at a desk on the executive floor. Her desk, now, relocated from the 42nd floor to the 38th, which Haddon Webb's former office had become because Haddon Webb was currently in a federal protection program, providing testimony that was, by all accounts, extremely detailed and useful. She had a new title. She had a new laptop. She had a small framed photo of Chester on the adding machine in the corner of the window, because the morning after the warehouse, someone had brought Chester to her new apartment, along with his food dish and his toys, and a carrier lined with his favorite blanket, and she had held him against her chest and breathed into his fur. And that was the moment, actually, that she'd cried. Not in the warehouse, not in the town car, in her new apartment, holding her cat, because someone had known to bring the blanket. She was working through a discrepancy in the first quarter projections when the door opened. Stellan Rourke came in without knocking, because he never knocked, which she had decided to find manageable rather than infuriating, because she had a limited daily budget for infuriation. He set a coffee on her desk, black, 1 sugar. She hadn't told him. He had noticed. She looked at the coffee for a moment. "Bergson," she said. "Taken care of," he said. Legally, a pause. Sufficiently. She decided that was as much information as she needed on that particular subject and looked back at her screen. He didn't leave. He stood at the window with his own coffee and looked at the lake, which was iron grey today and moving, and she was aware of him, the way she was always aware of him now. As a specific presence, not background noise, not furniture, not the problem she was not thinking about. "You're doing it again," he said. She looked up. "Doing what?" "Trying not to exist," he said. He turned from the window. "The way you fold yourself in, make yourself smaller." She opened her mouth and then closed it. "You found the thing my entire organization missed," he said. "You fixed it in 11 hours. You're sitting at a desk that has your name on it now, and you're still wearing that cardigan like an apology." She looked down at the cardigan. It was beige. It was a good cardigan. "I like this cardigan," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not criticizing the cardigan." She looked at him. He was looking at her the way he had in the warehouse when she'd laughed, unexpected and tired. And she thought about the weight she'd put on certain things in the waterproof compartment of her brain, and about whether the compartment was still waterproof, and about Chester on his blanket. "Opal," he said. She'd never heard him use her first name before. She thought about pointing that out and decided against it. "You're not invisible," he said. "You never were. I noticed you the first month you worked here. I noticed every month after that. You were the only person in that building who was exactly who she appeared to be, and you were." He stopped. Started again, because Stellan Rourke, she was learning, did not say things imprecisely when he could take a moment and say them correctly. "You were the most competent person in that building. And I couldn't tell you I knew that without telling you I knew why, and that was a problem." She was very still. "It's less of a problem now," he said. "Because I already know why," she said. "Yes, Chester's blanket, the pasta at 2 in the morning. The photograph." She looked at her desk, her name on the door, the coffee, black with 1 sugar that she hadn't asked for. "I still need to finish the first quarter projections," she said. "I know," he said, "and I'm going to find 2 more discrepancies before lunch, I think. There's something in the April figures that doesn't—" "Opal." She looked up. He was still at the window, the lake iron grey behind him, and he was looking at her with something that wasn't the problem-solving look, wasn't the management look, wasn't any of the looks she'd catalogued in the past 3 weeks of careful and completely professional observation. "You can finish the projections," he said. "And then you'll tell me what you found in the April figures. And we'll have dinner. And you'll bring Chester if you want, because my building allows animals. And he's apparently decided that my security team are his personal staff." She thought about Chester being carried by a man in a black jacket, entirely unbothered. She thought about balance sheets, about things that finally resolved. "He's very demanding," she said. "About the blanket." "I've been informed," Stellan Rourke said, and that thing that was almost amusement moved across his face, and she looked at her screen, because she had projections to finish, and because she needed approximately 30 seconds to put all of this somewhere organized. She found it. A moment later, a home for it in a part of her that wasn't waterproofed or weighted down, that had been waiting, she realized, with considerable patience for exactly this. "Dinner," she said, to the screen. "Fine." She heard him exhale, quiet like something released. Outside, the lake moved. The city hummed. Somewhere in a building across town, Chester was asleep on someone else's adding machine, waiting for her to come home to a life that had just become, in the careful and precise accounting of Opal Finch, something considerably more than enough.